When you picture prehistoric romance, what comes to mind? Probably a caveman dragging a woman by the hair back to his cave, right? It's a scene we've seen 1,000 times in movies and cartoons, and it's the foundation of a massive cultural myth. This is the story we've been told, that in the beginning, men were brutes who fought for women, and women were passive prizes who had no say in the matter. Well, I'm here to tell you that the science says this is almost completely false. The reality of how women chose their men in our ancestral past is not only more complex, but it's far more fascinating, and it completely rewrites the story of human evolution. What if I told you that our earliest female ancestors had complete freedom to divorce, that they actively chose their mates based on social skills and resourcefulness, and that their ability to choose may have been the driving force behind the very cooperation that made us human? These aren't just theories pulled from a history book. These are insights pulled from actual evolutionary psychology and anthropology research, from studying modern hunter-gatherer societies that mirror our ancestral past. You've never heard this version of history before. The story of ancient love is actually the story of female agency. In the next 10 minutes, we're going to rewrite the history of human courtship. Let's start by throwing the entire caveman narrative in the trash, because the first thing you need to know is that our hunter-gatherer ancestors were not living in a patriarchal nightmare. In fact, they had a level of autonomy that might surprise you. Consider the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last living hunter-gatherer populations on Earth. In Hadza society, women choose their own husbands, and they can simply walk away from marriage if it isn't working out. There's no ceremony, no exchanging of gifts, no legal hoops to jump through. Courtship is as simple as a man repeatedly bringing honey or wild meat to a woman's hut until she accepts him. If she gets bored or the guy isn't pulling his weight, she just leaves. This isn't a modern invention. It's a direct line to how our earliest ancestors likely navigated relationships. Now, this leads to a more complex and controversial idea. Researchers have proposed that ancestral women may have pursued a dual mating strategy. This theory suggests that women often needed two things: a good provider who would stick around and invest resources in raising their children, and good genes that would ensure healthy offspring. This creates a fascinating dynamic. Researchers studying the Himba people of Namibia, a pastoralist society, found evidence that in arranged marriages, where women had less choice, there was a measurable rate of misattributed paternity. However, in love marriages, where women made their own choice, this rate was essentially zero. This suggests that when women had the freedom to choose, the outcomes were dramatically different, challenging the idea that women were just passive participants in a system designed by men. It gets even more revolutionary. Some anthropologists argue that the power of female choice may have literally shaped early human cooperation, which is one of the defining features of our species. A 2015 study on the Agta and BaYaka hunter-gatherers found a remarkable thing. In these societies, both men and women have equal say in deciding where to live and who to live near. Because both sexes had a voice in social decisions, the communities became less genetically related to one another, meaning people were more likely to live with friends and in-laws than with a huge extended family of blood relatives. This, anthropologists believe, is what paved the way for cooperation between unrelated groups, a foundation of early human society. In other words, the ability to choose who they lived with helped our ancestors build networks of trust and support that weren't based on blood. And what were women looking for when making these choices? If you think it was just physical strength, you'd be wrong. Because pregnancy and infant care severely restricted a woman's mobility, the most critical survival factor wasn't the biggest man wins narrative. It was the reliability of provisioning during her most vulnerable periods. Sure, a man could be strong, but that strength was useless if he wasn't sharing his food or sticking around to help when she had a baby. The evolutionary pressure was on a man's ability to be a consistent provider, to bring back reliable food sources, and to be present. It wasn't just about his muscle mass. It was about his ability to solve problems and support his family. This wasn't a passive process of just picking the guy who brought the most meat, either. In certain small-scale societies like the Kolanakan of Kerala, suitors had to prove their mettle through competition, but it wasn't fighting. When multiple men wanted the same woman, they competed in tasks like tree climbing for honey. It was skill, resourcefulness, and the ability to provide a valuable resource that decided who won her hand. This kind of competition reinforces the idea that women valued practical intelligence and the capacity to solve problems over brute force. So, if men weren't always the dominant deciders, who was shaping these choices? This is where things get fascinating. The grandmother hypothesis suggests that senior women's foraging and food sharing had a more significant evolutionary impact on family structure than paternal provisioning. This means that grandmothers, not male strength, may have been the primary agents in shaping who paired up with whom. Female elders had the life experience and knowledge to know which men were reliable providers and which social connections were most beneficial for the group. Their influence on family decisions would have been immense, making them the unseen matchmakers of ancient history. It wasn't the patriarch, it was the matriarch. This brings us to what women were actually looking for. It turns out, it wasn't just the biggest hunter with the most bison meat. Among BaYaka and Agta women, what really mattered was relational wealth. Having many social connections was linked to fertility and survival outcomes even more than material wealth. This means a man's social network, his friendships, his ability to get along with others, and his place in the community may have been just as attractive to a woman as his hunting skill. It's the ancient version of seeing that a guy is respected by his friends. And here's a myth buster that will challenge the modern dating scene. We often assume that ancient women had a huge pool of eligible bachelors to choose from. But the truth is, this pool essentially didn't exist in small ancestral bands. Most people were related, and your choices were limited to a very small group. This completely changes the dynamic from a modern dating app, where you can swipe through hundreds of options. It means the decisions women made were incredibly high stakes, and they were made with a much deeper knowledge of the people in their community. Even though our environment has changed, our instincts haven't. A landmark study analyzing over 1,100 real personal advertisements found that the same mate preference patterns theorized to come from ancestral mating psychology are still measurable today. Women's ads consistently emphasized resource cues, like a good career or financial stability, while men's emphasized youth and fertility cues. These patterns, shaped over millennia, remain almost unchanged, showing how deeply this ancestral algorithm is embedded in our psychology. But perhaps the most important takeaway is a simple one. In egalitarian tribes, women were not passive. Anthropological fieldwork repeatedly describes Hadza women as vocal, opinionated, and active agents in their relationships. They chose, they rejected, and they negotiated for what they wanted. They were not prizes to be won. They were the selectors. The popular assumption that ancient mate selection was purely male-driven is a myth, and a damaging one that has been used to justify inequality for centuries. So what does this all tell us? It tells us that the story of human evolution is fundamentally a story of female choice. It suggests that women's preferences for reliable providers, social connectors, and resourceful individuals drove the development of crucial human traits, cooperation, complex social structures, and even the intelligence necessary for problem solving. The movies have it backward. Men weren't just competing for dominance. They were competing to be chosen, and they had to adapt to meet the standards of the women in their tribe. This is also why hunter-gatherer societies are remarkably egalitarian. When women have agency and choice, it creates a balanced power dynamic. It wasn't a patriarchy, it was a partnership. The implications for today are profound. We often believe that our preferences for certain traits, our career ambitions, or our fears of commitment are products of modern life. But the science shows us that these drives are ancient. We can trace them back to the savannah, to the small camps of our ancestors where a woman's decision to accept honey from a man could change the course of human history. So, the next time you think about cavemen, remember the reality. A man's ability to be resourceful, respectful, and socially connected wasn't just a nice bonus. It was an evolutionary requirement, a requirement set by women. Ultimately, understanding our ancient past gives us a new lens to view the present. It challenges us to question the natural excuses used to justify inequality, because they were never natural in the first place. The evidence is clear. Women were not passive victims of evolution. They were its architects. The story of how women chose men in ancient times is not just a history lesson. It is a profound insight into who we are and how we came to be. The ancestors who thrived weren't just the strongest, but the ones who were accepted and chosen. This is the narrative we should be teaching, not the myth of the caveman, but the reality of the human story, where the power of choice belongs to us all. What did you think about this? It's a pretty radical shift from what we're usually told, right? Let me know in the comments if this changed your perspective on ancient history, or if you have any questions about the research. If you found this as fascinating as I did, please give it a like and subscribe for more deep dives into history, psychology, and the science of being human. And remember, the past isn't a story of brutes and victims. It's a story of intelligence. Cooper.